Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of Geostrategy with me, your host, AbhijitChavda. We are living in a time of war, my friends. There are wars happening across the world. There is a war in Ukraine that's been going on since 2022. There's a new war now in the West Asia region, in the Middle East. It is Israel and Iran that are at war. We have conflicts that are raging in Africa that nobody pays attention to. It's a time of war. And this raises multiple questions. It raises several questions. Firstly, I would like to ask this: why do some nations have the right to have nuclear weapons, but other nations don't have that right? Who decides which nation has the right to have nuclear powers and which doesn't? Why do some nations have the right and others aren't allowed to? Secondly, we must ask ourselves that imagine a world in which India had not acquired nuclear weapons and deployed them back in the day. Then what would have been India's fate today? Because nuclear weapons seem to be the only guarantee of survivability in the world today, and that you will not be blackmailed beyond a limit and bullied beyond a limit. And this time of war, we are seeing this war that is actually illegal according to what they call international law. According to international law, according to the so-called rules-based world order, the war that's going on right now, it's illegal. There have been airstrikes and missile strikes on nuclear facilities. That is not allowed according to international law. And you cannot simply attack a nation, launch missile strikes at a nation without having a just cause for that. So you have all of this happening in the world, and that raises one more question that I would like to ask today. Why does the United Nations exist? What is the purpose of the United Nations? Isn't it to prevent such wars? Or if such wars break out, isn't the purpose to stop such wars, mediate, and do peacekeeping? What is the role of the United Nations today? Is it simply just a huge, immense waste of resources and money and time and energy of various nations? We donate a lot of money to the United Nations for its upkeep, for the upkeep of the organization and the salaries of their officials and the trips of their officials and whatnot. We contribute peacekeeping troops to the United Nations that are generally deployed somewhere in Africa. But what about these other conflicts? Why isn't the UN able to do a thing about these conflicts? So why don't we, before we get into the main thing, why don't we take a look at the United Nations and the role that it is supposed to play? And let's also take a look at what it has achieved and what it is not able to achieve right now. So let's take a look at the United Nations and the role it plays. So the UN, what is the purpose and the history? What's the history of the UN? What's the purpose for which this organization was created? So this organization, the United Nations, was established in 1945 following the events of the Second World War. And the fundamental purpose of the United Nations was to prevent future conflicts, and it was to promote international cooperation. And the UN was created as a successor nation to the League of Nations, which was deemed to be super ineffective in preventing the Second World War. And the founding charter of the United Nations, it says that it determines to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And it seeks to establish conditions under which justice and international law can be maintained. And this organization, the UN, exists to fulfill four fundamental objectives that are enshrined in its founding charter. Okay, so first of all, you have maintaining peace and security. Then you have developing friendly relations between nations, promoting international cooperation, and serving as a harmonizing center, a forum for nations to coordinate their actions towards achieving these common goals, these four common goals. Right? So maintaining international peace and security, it's the UN, its responsibility is to take effective collective measures for the prevention of threats to peace, and if such threats to peace do occur, then to remove these threats to peace. The objective is to suppress acts of aggression, and the objective is to bring about peaceful resolution of various disputes in accordance with the principles of justice and international law. And the UN, its objective is to foster diplomatic relations between nations based on respect for equal rights and self-determination of the people of the world. And it's supposed to take steps and measures to strengthen universal peace. And then there is international cooperation. So the UN is supposed to facilitate cooperation and collaboration in solving various international problems, economic problems, social problems, cultural problems, humanitarian issues, and so on. So that is the deal. That is why the UN exists. Now, these are the reasons why the United Nations exists. All of that, what I just said. Now, what has been the UN's role and its function during times when conflicts have erupted? So, when conflicts erupt, the UN is supposed to employ various mechanisms to respond to these conflicts. The primary organ of the UN in dealing with conflicts is the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. Now, has it succeeded at all in the past few years, in your living memory? Has the United Nations Security Council succeeded in doing this? It doesn't look like it has. So, what are the key wartime functions of the United Nations? First of all, conflict prevention and also early warning of conflicts. So the UN is supposed to use diplomacy, it's supposed to use its good offices, it's supposed to use mediation and other such measures to help nations prevent conflicts, and if conflicts do occur, then to help nations resolve these conflicts peacefully and make sure that conflicts do not escalate. Then there are peacekeeping operations. So the UN, it deploys various military observers, lightly armed troops, and civilian personnel to monitor ceasefires, to protect civilians, and to support peace processes. Have we seen any evidence of this in recent times? I'm not sure we have, my friends. Then there is peace enforcement. So under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the UN Security Council can authorize the use of military force when peaceful measures prove to be inadequate. Well, have we seen any of that in our recent memory, living memory? Then there is humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aid. UN agencies are supposed to provide critical aid to civilians who are affected by conflicts, which includes obviously food and medical care and protection for refugees. Now, is that happening in Africa? I don't think the world is even looking at what's happening in Africa right now. In Sudan, in Somalia, in the Rwanda region, and so many other regions, in the Congo region. Is any of this happening? A little bit may be happening, but I assure you it's not happening the way it's supposed to happen. Right? So these are the wartime functions. Now let's look at past history that may be beyond our living memory. So we've had some successful United Nations military interventions during wartime in the past. One example that is touted is the UN role during the Korean War, which was 1950 to 1953. So during this time, the UN Security Council, it authorized military intervention after the conflict erupted. And this was probably one of the first major UN-sanctioned military operations. And this intervention by the UN, it successfully prevented the North Korean conquest of the South. And it required a significant amount of international military commitment. So the UN intervention, it essentially led to an outcome that was favorable for the United States, right? And it was unfavorable for North Korea and its benefactors, which were China and the USSR. So the UN intervened successfully in favor of the United States, essentially. Okay, now let's move on to the first Gulf War, 1990-1991. So Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. He was given the go-ahead tacitly by the US, and then he was thrown under the bus. So after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678, which authorized all necessary means to remove the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And this led to the successful liberation of Kuwait through Operation Desert Storm, which was led by the United States, but it had this coalition of nations that participated in it. So you could say that what happened during the first Gulf War was a successful UN military intervention. Then you had Libya 2011. Okay, so the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1973, which established a no-fly zone over Libya, and it again authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians during the Libyan civil war, which was a regime change operation, as we know, right? And this intervention by the UN successfully contributed to the fall of the government of Muammar Gaddafi, and this was a victory for the US. So you can see multiple times, whether it's the Korean War, whether it's the first Gulf War, whether it's Libya, the UN has been able to intervene successfully when when the intervention aligned with the interests of the United States, right? Clearly. Now let's take a look at some failures, some notable failures of the United Nations. So, despite the successes that we highlighted, which all contributed to US victories essentially, or the achievement of US objectives, despite those successes, we have multiple instances, many instances, where the UN has experienced significant failures that have obviously damaged its credibility, and these failures have shown, they have demonstrated the limitations of of international intervention when the so-called global community is not interested, uh, because it doesn't align with the interests of the most important or most powerful nations. So let's take some examples. First of all, we have the Rwanda genocide, 1994, and the driving force behind the Rwanda genocide was the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has actually apologized eventually for its role in the genocide. So the UN failed to prevent the Rwandan genocide. It failed to stop the genocide once it started. And this is one of the most devastating failures, one could say, in reasonably recent times of the United Nations. So the UN assistance mission for Rwanda was severely constrained by its limited Chapter 6 mandate, which essentially rendered it powerless to intervene militarily. So there were multiple failures at multiple levels. First of all, there was the ignored evidence that genocide was being planned. There was the refusal to authorize the force commander to seize weapons that were being stockpiled for the genocide. Then most peacekeepers were withdrawn after 10 Belgian soldiers were killed. And then the UN abandoned Tutsi refugees in supposed safe zones. So about 1 million people were murdered while UN forces just stood by and essentially just stood by and watched, more or less. And so there was a 1999 UN report which kind of went through what happened, okay? And it called this mission disgraceful. And it acknowledged that the organization, the UN, had systematically failed in preventing the genocide and stopping the genocide. So the UN forces largely stood by as bystanders. They just watched while 1 million people were killed. This terrible, terrible. Then there is Somalia, there is Syria. So the UN has been involved in Somalia, but it's not really achieved anything. The UN-backed transitional federal government has been criticized by most observers as being super corrupt and extremely ineffective. It's existing primarily due to donor funding and African Union peacekeepers rather than genuine governance capacity. So that's a failure. Then there is Syria, which happened recently. I mean, the Syrian conflict began as a Western-led regime change operation around 2010, more or less, plus or minus a couple of years. And that has devastated the nation. And that's been a long-standing crisis in West Asia, and the UN has been completely unable to address this conflict, right? And this happened because the UN Security Council's permanent members were severely divided about the direction in which the conflict should go. So the UN Security General Antonio Gutiérrez, he described this escalating conflict as a result of chronic collective failure of diplomacy. So essentially, Russia and China wanted a certain set of, they wanted the Syrian conflict to end in a certain way, and the US had a totally different set of objectives for the Syrian conflict. And that's why nothing ever happened. So the Security Council ended up being paralyzed because of various vetoes by permanent members, and this essentially prevented any effective international intervention. And this conflict just went on, and eventually it ended with a regime change, successful regime change, and Mr. Assad, the dictator, was overthrown, and a new dictator has been placed in power, a former terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head. Right. Uh, so now let's take a look at what are the limitations that can be observed when it comes to the United Nations. First of all, there is the veto power paralysis. So there are 5 permanent UN Security Council members, and these nations have been permanent members since the end of the Second World War, 1945, and this represents a completely obsolete, completely outdated power structure of the world. So these are unqualified members who don't even most of them possibly don't even deserve to be there on the UN Security Council. But they have this veto power, this unqualified veto power. And this often prevents decisive action when their interests conflict. And this has rendered the Security Council ineffective in crisis after crisis. Then there are mandate constraints. So many peacekeeping missions, which are generally deployed in Africa, they operate under a variety of restrictive mandates that limit their ability to use force, even when facing mass atrocities. So the example of Rwanda, which I just mentioned, is a case in point. Then there are resource limitations. The UN says they have insufficient funding. Well, that's a joke essentially, but they say there is insufficient funding and insufficient troop contributions from various nations, and this apparently hampers the effectiveness of missions. Well, that's when you have missions that are deployed in Africa or wherever. But what about the big conflicts where the UN hasn't even been able to enter the conflict to try and prevent the conflict, essentially, right? Excuse me. And then there's the lack of political will. There's a lack of genuine commitment from various member states, which frequently undermines UN operations. Now, let's take a look at the current crisis. Not the Ukraine crisis, which is now old news apparently for many people, but the Israel-Iran crisis. What's the UN's role been in this crisis? Right? So, this crisis began, it escalated, it's been happening under the shadows, but it escalated dramatically this month, June 2025, with a direct military confrontation between the two nations. The escalation was started by Israel, which launched strikes on various Iranian facilities, etc. So that's how the escalation began, and then there's been a back and forth of various kinds. So this conflict has exposed the fundamental weaknesses in the UN's capacity to fulfill its primary mandate, its core mandate of maintaining international peace and security. The UN's primary mandate, it has one job essentially, right? To maintain international peace and security. And it has failed miserably at that when it comes to the Israel-Iran war. So the UN's response to this crisis, it demonstrates a pattern of institutional paralysis. It shows that there is continuing diplomatic ineffectiveness, and there are a variety of structural limitations that kind of echo the UN's failures in previous Middle Eastern conflicts. So what are the UN emergency response mechanisms? First of all, you have Security Council meetings, emergency meetings of the UN Security Council. That's the primary response mechanism when something like this happens, some conflict erupts somewhere. So the UN Security Council has convened multiple emergency sessions ever since this conflict began. So this demonstrates that the UN is aware of the crisis, and it's aware of the severity of the crisis, the Israel-Iran issue, right? And I think on June 20, that's a couple of days ago, the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo warned that the window to prevent a catastrophic escalation and achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict has not yet closed, which means that the UN can still, at this point in time, intervene and limit the conflict, maybe achieve a peaceful resolution. And she acknowledged that Israel has struck more than 100 sites in Iran, including nuclear facilities. And the UN Secretary General, the boss of Miss Di Carlo, Mr. Antonio Guterres, he has repeatedly verbally emphasized the gravity of the situation. He has said during emergency meetings that we are not drifting towards crisis, we are racing towards it. Right, and he has warned that there are moments when the direction taken will shape not only the fate of nations but the future of humanity, and this is such a moment. So clearly, he's aware of the gravity of the situation. He's aware of the severity of the crisis, and he has called for both parties to give peace a chance. So it's all words thus far. It's all words. Do you understand the difference between words and actions? It's just verbal exhortations, but no actual action. So this is the UN's traditional diplomatic approach with zero practical effect. Right? Okay. So now we have Security Council paralysis. I mean, that's why it has not been able to achieve anything thus far during this current conflict. So the Security Council, it is unable to pass meaningful resolutions. It has tried, apparently. I mean, they've convened multiple emergency sessions, but it has been unable to pass any meaningful resolution. Right? This shows the organization's structural limitations and its obsolescence. The UN Security Council is not something that can, in today's day and age, make a difference to the world. It can't achieve any meaningful action or change on the ground. So Russia and China proposed a resolution which called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. But this measure faced US opposition. Right? So this was a draft resolution that condemned the attacks on Iran's nuclear sites. And it did not name the US or Israel. But this resolution, it required at least 9 affirmative votes, and it required no vetoes from permanent members of the UN Security Council. So the US has blocked such resolutions. It has consistently opposed resolutions that fail to condemn Hamas or call for the disarmament of Hamas, and so on. So the US ambassador has said that the US has been clear that we will never support any measure that fails to condemn Hamas and does not call for Hamas to disarm and leave Gaza. But what does that have to do with the Israel-Iran thing and so on, right? So the historical pattern of US vetoes is pretty clear, and the current crisis follows that pattern of US vetoes, which are pertaining to Middle Eastern conflicts. So in March 2024, the US abstained from a UN Security Council resolution which called for a ceasefire in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the US was obviously driven by dissatisfaction of the resolution's failure to condemn Hamas. And this is a pattern that you see over and over again, and this has undermined the UN's capacity to address these Middle East and West Asian crises effectively or at all. So let's do an assessment of UN failures. First of all, there is institutional paralysis. And the UN Secretary General himself, Mr. Guterres, himself has acknowledged that this is the case. He gave an interview to Al Jazeera in which he said that the UN Security Council is outdated. It is unfair. It's an ineffective system. And the failures are manifold. There's failure to end the conflict in Gaza. There is the failure to end the conflict in Sudan, and the complete inaction of the UN when it comes to Ukraine. All of this is, well, it has completely, totally damaged the UN's credibility, destroyed the UN's credibility, right? So there is institutional paralysis. The Security Council does not correspond to the world of today, and that's what Mr. Guterres has said. It has systematically failed in relation to the capacity to put an end to the most dramatic conflicts. So there is institutional paralysis. And then there are structural limitations. The structure of the UN Security Council, the fact that some members have a veto power. So even if everybody votes for something, one member can prevent a resolution from going through. So that's the veto power paralysis. Unqualified veto power of the 5 permanent Security Council members that is guaranteed to prevent any decisive action from the UN when their interests are in conflict with such action. And the US opposition to resolutions critical of Israel, it effectively blocks a variety of multilateral responses that could have perhaps, made a difference. And then there are mandate constraints, which we discussed, which is not that important when it comes to the Israel Iran thing. And there are limited enforcement mechanisms, which is very important. So the UN lacks effective tools to compel compliance with international law when major powers are involved. When small nations are involved, the UN can compel them. But when major powers are involved, the UN just steps aside and watches. It doesn't have any tool to compel compliance with international law when one of the big nations is involved, right? So the UN experts have condemned Israel's attacks on Iranian nuclear sites as flagrant violations of of international law. But this condemnation does not carry any kind of enforcement mechanism, right? We have more failures. We have legal failures, normative failures, violations of international law. So we have seen extensive violations of international law during this conflict, which is pretty short thus far. I mean, imagine attacking nuclear facilities which are under IAEA safeguards. Imagine that. That is a flagrant violation of international law. Then there is the targeting of civilian infrastructure. Then there are extrajudicial killings of Iranian scientists and military commanders, right? So these actions, these attacks, they strike at the core of the international system, which is founded on the respect for the sovereign equality of states, the so-called rules-based world order, completely flagrantly violated, right? So the targeting of Iran's nuclear facilities, it's a challenge to the international non-proliferation regime. The US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, they constitute violations, according to legal scholars, of international law as well as the UN Charter. But so they are illegal under international law, and they also potentially violate US domestic law. But does it make any difference? It makes no difference whatsoever. Then there's the failure to prevent escalation. Um, so this conflict, the Israel Iran conflict, this existed as the regional proxy warfare. The Houthis were involved, Hamas was involved, Hezbollah was involved, and so on and so forth. So this existed in the form of regional proxy warfare. But now it has escalated to a state-on-state conflict. And everybody could have seen this coming. Everybody could have seen this coming. So this happened, and the UN was unable to prevent this escalation. Right? So this is a fundamental failure of the UN's preventive diplomacy mandate. The UN has early warning systems, right? The UN can do diplomatic interventions, and it did try to do that, but all of these things proved insufficient to prevent the escalation. And now we are in crisis mode. This is a very dangerous, very potentially very dangerous conflict that we are witnessing. So the UN has failed. Its mandate has failed. It's an institutional crisis. We are seeing the same patterns of structural weakness from the UN ever since the Cold War has ended. The organization is unable to prevent escalation. It's unable to broker any meaningful ceasefires. It's unable to enforce international law. And this is a continuation now of the failures we have witnessed in Rwanda, in Syria, in Yugoslavia, and various other major crises. The Security Council is paralyzed due to great power competition. It's paralyzed because of the politicization of these issues, right? And whenever there's a critical conflict, the UN is marginalized. Complete systemic failure. And there are peacekeeping limitations and so on. And essentially, at the end of the day, what I would say is that this current crisis, the Israel-Iran crisis, has exposed the fundamental obsolescence of the UN. It's an obsolete organization. The UN Security Council is completely obsolete. It is fundamentally incompatible with the post 1945 institutional design, that design is fundamentally incompatible with the realities of 21st century geopolitical competition. Now and that is the reason why India has been repeatedly and consistently calling for a reorganization and reforms of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. So today, the UN faces an existential question about its relevance to international peace and security in this new era of renewed great power rivalry and multipolarity, and this complete, very rapid, ongoing global geopolitical realignment. The UN has failed to fulfill its core mandate during this crisis, as we can see in front of our eyes right now. And hopefully, this should constitute a definitive turning point in the UN's role as supposedly the primary institution for global governance and conflict resolution. I think it's high time the UN is reformed and fundamental changes are made that will actually enable it to carry out its stated duties. So that's about the UN. Now let us talk about the conflict. Today we're going to talk about the conflict, which is the Israel-Iran conflict. So what's happened thus far? I last spoke about this on the 19th of June. So what's happened? June 19 onward. So the past 3-4 days, we have seen a dramatic escalation in the hostilities between Israel and Iran. And the US is now directly and majorly involved. So we have high intensity military exchanges, significant casualties, and increasingly major geopolitical repercussions. So 19th of June, we had further Israeli strikes in Iran. Israel continued its air campaign. It targeted Iranian nuclear and military strikes. Israeli strikes killed various senior commanders in the IRGC aerospace force and the Quds force, including Behnam Shahriari, who was responsible for arms transfers to Hezbollah, apparently, allegedly, and some other leaders as well. Then there was an Iranian missile attack on Israel on the same day. And so it was a retaliatory attack which hit various parts of Israel. And the Prime Minister Netanyahu warned Iran that Iran would pay a heavy price. And he then spoke about regime change. He did not rule out that regime change could be a possible outcome of the war. So it was not an explicit goal, but it was a threat. It was a warning. And Mr. Trump on 19 June said that he was undecided about potential US military involvement. And he suggested that there could be a 2-week window for diplomatic resolution. And then the next day, essentially June 2021, the US entered the conflict, right? So we have the Israeli strikes in Iran, we have the Iranian missile attack, we have leadership statements, and then the US enters the conflict on June 2021. The US conducted airstrikes on Iranian nuclear strikes. So on June 21, President Trump announced that US forces had bombed 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And this operation involved B-2 bombers and Tomahawk missiles and bunker buster bombs. And Mr. Trump described the operation as being extraordinarily and overwhelmingly successful. And the full extent of the damage remains unclear, actually. Okay, and this was done with full coordination with Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu and his top security officials, they held extended meetings as the US attack unfolded. And so on. There were various countries condemned the US airstrikes, including Latin American countries. Iran denounced the attacks as violations of international law, which they clearly are. And the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was also violated by the strikes. The Iranian foreign minister said that the US had crossed a red line, and there were threats of further retaliation, and including warnings of possible attacks on US interests in the region, of which there are many. But overall, there is a high likelihood that the Iranian nuclear program has survived. So first of all, Mr. Trump had foreshadowed his bombing for close to 2 weeks. So it was not like it was not known this could be coming. and Iran had more than sufficient time to relocate its critical materials and equipment to other places. And there is clear satellite evidence of materials being removed from these nuclear sites via truck convoys to other locations in Iran. So it's highly likely that the nuclear program has not been devastated, it has not been destroyed. There could be damage to these facilities, but the nuclear program is most likely it has most likely survived this bombardment. Then June 22 and June 23, there were retaliatory attacks. And now the targets are expanding. So the Iranians, they launched this missile barrage. They launched at least two missile attacks, major missile attacks on Israel. They fired about 30 missiles that struck various cities like Haifa, Tel Aviv, and so on. At least 21 people apparently are wounded. Significant damage has been reported in Tel Aviv. A collapsed building and so on and so forth. Iran used various advanced missiles like the Khaybar Shekan, which is the Khurram Shahar 4 missile, ballistic missile. Then there were Israeli counterstrikes. Israel responded with further airstrikes on Iranian missile and drone sites, including Isfahan, Bushehr, Ahwaz, and Yazd. Israeli aircraft targeted missile launchers. They killed Iranian soldiers who were apparently, allegedly preparing more launches. So Operation Rising Lion is the operation that is the name of the operation by Israel. And since the start of this operation, Iran has fired about 450 missiles and 400 drones in Israel, and about 24 Israeli fatalities are known, and so on. And the US has been warning Iran that any retaliation against US interests would be met with severe consequences, and so on. On June 23, there were further attacks on Iran, on Tehran, by Israel, and so on. So it's an ongoing situation. It's an ongoing situation. Now, what are the strategic implications of what's going on? So, first of all, what are the Israeli objectives? Possibly, yeah. So, Israel aims to degrade Iran's nuclear program and missile capabilities. And some Israeli officials are openly discussing targeting Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah, as one of the objectives of the war. The US is involved, and the US justified its strikes as saying that it was necessary to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities because apparently some countries can have nukes but others can't, right? And the US used bunker buster bombs on deeply buried facilities like Fordo and so on. Iran has threatened to expand its retaliation to US forces in the region. The US has a lot of military bases in the region. So Iran is now threatening those military bases, and Iran is very capable of targeting those bases. And Iran has also threatened to disrupt shipping, to close off the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that would be a disaster for the world, actually. And diplomatic efforts are stalled because neither side has moderated its demands, and diplomatic channels are essentially stalled right now. So that is what has happened the past few days since I last spoke about this matter, just the past 4 days or so. Now, I had made some forecasts about what could happen going forward. So let's take a look at the forecasts and see how my forecasts fared. So this is the analysis for the past 70 to 90 days day forecast, which I had done on June 19. So according to that set of forecasts, scenario A was a sustained regional conflict. There would be direct exchanges. So there would be direct exchanges, but that would then transform into a shadow war and a proxy war. The direct state-on-state military exchanges will continue between the two nations, but the conflict will transform into a sustained high-intensity shadow war, proxy war across multiple fronts. And there'll be intensive diplomatic pressure from the US, Russia, Gulf countries, etc., which will establish fragile red lines, preventing a full-scale conventional war. And the US will maintain its significant presence and so on in the region. But according to the scenario, the US will avoid direct participation in offensive operations against Israel. I said this would have a probability of 75% over about 90 days. Scenario B was US intervention and a regional war. So I said that maybe a significant proxy, significant trigger event like a successful Iranian proxy attack on a US naval vessel or a strike on a US base or something like that, would then justify a US intervention against Iran. And then the US, in coordination with Israel, will launch limited strikes against Iran's hardened nuclear facilities like Fordo, etc., and command and control centers, military centers. And then this will lead to the conflict expanding into a broader but not total regional war. And Iran will attempt to to disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and so on. So I said this would have a probability of 20% over 14 to 60 days. And scenario C was a rapid de-escalation scenario. So what's happened thus far? So if we assess what happened, we will find that the highest probability scenario which I had given has not been realized, right? Because the US has intervened directly. So scenario B has come to pass, which had a 20% probability, in my opinion. So that's how things go. That's how things go. Mr. Netanyahu has convinced Mr. Trump to get involved, and this time the US has not needed any justification, any just cause for war. I mean, if there was an attack on a US base or a US shipping vessel or a US warship or a major attack on Israeli population center, that would justify the US getting involved. But the US justification has been that we can't allow Iran to have nukes. And the US went ahead and intervened. So scenario B, which should have been a less likely scenario, has come true. And the US has conducted airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. And scenario C has not come true, as we can clearly see. Okay. So scenario B is confirmed. We've had airstrikes. We have US airstrikes on 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities. We have continued Israeli strikes, which are ongoing. There is continuing Iranian retaliation, missile and drone attacks. And there is clear coordination between the US and Israel. So that is where we are today. Okay, we have discussed the UN. We have discussed what's happened the past 3-4 days. Now let us look forward, my friends. This is not a news show. This is a show in which we look forward. It's a forward-looking show. And we try and understand causality in this show, in Geostrategy with me. We try and understand causality, the cause and effect chain. Why do things happen? Why do things happen the way they do? And based on that logic, what could happen going forward? And what are the deep, somewhat unknown, slightly buried causes of what could be going on? So the past week or two, I have spoken about President Trump and his personal business interests that seem to be dictating his behavior and his choices and his actions as US president, right? He's personally invested in Pakistan and so much more. Today, let us take a look at another leader and what could be the root cause of his actions. And the leader I'm talking about is Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. So Mr. Netanyahu has been facing a variety of political challenges. And the question is, could those political challenges that Mr. Netanyahu is facing as of today, could those challenges be a critical factor in his actions, in his decisions, and in the ongoing eventual direction that this war will take, the Israel-Iran war, right? So Mr. Netanyahu, he is facing corruption troubles. This began in December 2016 when Israeli police launched investigations into allegations of fraud and breach of trust and bribery. And the investigations initially focused on 2 cases. In August 2017, Israeli police officially confirmed that Mr. Netanyahu was suspected of crimes involving fraud, breach of trust, and bribes. In February 2018, Israeli police recommended that Mr. Netanyahu be charged with corruption. They said that there is sufficient evidence that existed to indict Mr. Netanyahu on charges of bribery and fraud and breach of trust. This is all out in the public domain. Okay, you can look it up. So this was a significant escalation in the legal proceedings against Israel's longest-serving prime minister, right? So let's take a look at. So let's take a look at these core cases. This is the timeline of what I just mentioned. What are the core cases? There are three core cases. Okay, three distinct cases which were filed, I think, in 2019. There is case 1000, which is called the Gifts Affair. So Mr. Netanyahu and his wife have been accused of receiving lavish gifts, worth approximately between 192 to 280 thousand US dollars from various wealthy businessmen, including a Hollywood producer, including the Australian businessman billionaire James Packer, son of Kerry Packer. The gifts included allegedly cigars and champagne and jewelry, expensive accommodations in exchange for political favors, such as tax breaks and business contracts. Then there is case 2000, which is a media deal. This case involves allegations that Mr. Netanyahu attempted to negotiate a quid pro quo arrangement with the publisher of the Yediot Aronot newspaper. And Mr. Netanyahu, according to the allegations, allegedly offered to help improve the newspaper's circulation and to advance legislation to weaken the newspaper's rival in exchange for more favorable coverage of Mr. Netanyahu. Then there is case 4000, the Bezek case, which involves allegations that Mr. Netanyahu granted regulatory favors worth about $500 million to the Bezek telecommunications company. And in return, prosecutors allege that he sought positive media coverage for himself and his wife on the news website that is controlled by this company. So these are the allegations, pretty serious allegations, and according to the Israeli police, there is evidence that supports these allegations, which is why the cases have been filed. So in November 21, 2019, Mr. Netanyahu was indicted, which made him the first sitting Israeli prime minister to face criminal charges. Mr. Netanyahu was charged with bribery in case 4000, which we just mentioned, and he was charged with fraud and breach of trust in all three cases. This trial began on May 24, 2020, in Jerusalem District Court. Mr. Netanyahu initially sought immunity from prosecution, but he then withdrew this immunity request on January 28, 2020, which allowed the charges to proceed. And the trial has faced numerous delays, and the prosecution rested its case in July 2024. It's about less than a year ago. And in December 2024, Mr. Netanyahu became the first sitting Israeli prime minister to testify in court as a criminal defendant. He took the stand to defend himself against the corruption allegations. And if he is convicted, in the case that he is convicted, he faces up to 10 years in prison for bribery charges, and up to 3 years for fraud and breach of trust. Now, what's been the political impact of all of this on Mr. Netanyahu's political career and his public perception? So there have been electoral consequences. The corruption charges have significantly impacted Mr. Netanyahu's political standing, and it has also impacted Israeli politics more broadly. So the 2019-2020 elections were regarded as a referendum on Mr. Netanyahu's corruption charges. And this divided the political system, it divided the media, and it divided the Israeli public into pro-Netanyahu and anti-Netanyahu camps. Polarization. So this polarization led to 4 snap elections in under 4 years. Tremendous political instability in Israel, as Mr. Netanyahu struggled to form stable governing coalitions. But despite these charges, Mr. Netanyahu managed to maintain his political position through strategic coalition building. And after the 2022 elections, he successfully formed what some media persons have described as the most right-wing government in Israel's history, with the support of what they call far-right parties. Now, what about the public opinion of Mr. Netanyahu? So, public opinion about Mr. Netanyahu's guilt or not being guilty has remained divided, but it's very concerning for the prime minister. So in 2017, a survey found that 54% of Israelis did not believe that Mr. Netanyahu was entirely innocent of the corruption allegations. And only 34% of Israelis believed his claims of innocence. And 63% of Israelis who were polled believed that he should resign if he was charged by the Attorney General. But however, Mr. Netanyahu's approval ratings have shown some resilience despite all these troubles. Before the allegations, about 52% of Israelis approved of his job performance, which was one of his higher ratings in recent tenure. And his lowest approval rating was in 2035. So it was 35% in 2012, when he also faced allegations of corruption. Now, there is more. There's a judicial reform controversy. So these corruption charges that Mr. Netanyahu faces, they directly influenced his controversial judicial reform agenda, which began in 2023. So his government attempted to, what a lot of the media says, they attempted to weaken the judiciary. Okay, that's what a lot of people claim. And this was viewed by a lot of people as motivated by Mr. Netanyahu's desire to escape legal consequences. So he attempted to overhaul the judiciary, and this sparked massive protests in Israel, and it created the worst domestic crisis in the history of Israel. And this brought together a very broad opposition movement. It galvanized a broad coalition against Mr. Netanyahu. Now, moving forward, on October 7, 2023, there was a devastating terrorist attack by the terrorist organization Hamas on Israel, right? And this was clearly a monumental security failure and intelligence failure by Israel. And this initially dealt a severe blow to the standing of Mr. Netanyahu. It dealt a severe blow to his political standing. He appeared shell-shocked. He appeared diminished by this surprise attack, which created a national emergency, and this caused his public support to drop very significantly, very sharply. It plummeted. And many Israelis blamed Mr. Netanyahu for the security failures, the intelligence failures, etc., that allowed this attack to actually occur. And there was an independent commission of inquiry, and this commission found that Mr. Netanyahu had consistently undermined the government's national security decision-making process. And it said that Mr. Netanyahu had exhibited arrogance and inherent blindness that left Israel unprepared for this devastating terrorist attack by Hamas. And this commission accused Mr. Netanyahu of strengthening Hamas by facilitating fund transfers while avoiding any offensive initiatives against Hamas. So, bad time for Mr. Netanyahu. But despite this initial blame that he took for October 7, Mr. Netanyahu demonstrated significant political resilience. Remarkable political resilience. By May 2024, it looks like he had regained favor with Israeli voters. He had overtaken his main rival, Benny Gantz, for the first time since October 7, right? And this was a significant shift from December 2023, where Mr. Gantz held a commanding 45% to 27% lead over Mr. Netanyahu. So, what contributed to Mr. Netanyahu's recovery? Well, several factors contributed. First of all, there was the passage of time, which allowed the focus to shift from the failures of October 7 to the ongoing security challenges. Mr. Netanyahu's political coalition and operation continued attacking opponents. And then this conflict, the Gaza conflict, it provided opportunities to demonstrate leadership. So this ongoing war in Gaza, it diverted public attention from the corruption trial, which was repeatedly delayed because of this ongoing conflict. Now the question is this: is the Iran conflict political salvation, potentially, for Mr. Netanyahu? So the escalation with Iran has definitely provided Mr. Netanyahu with a lot of political breathing room. So just one day before launching Operation Rising Lion against Iran, Mr. Netanyahu narrowly survived a no confidence vote in the Israeli parliament, which could have collapsed his government. And the operation against Iran immediately unified Israeli politics behind Mr. Netanyahu. Just one day after he narrowly survived this confidence motion in parliament. So what's been the outcome thus far of the attack on Iran? So there's been unprecedented national unity that's come out of this. The attack on Iran has achieved what Mr. Netanyahu's previous military actions could not achieve. Now there is broad national consensus across the political spectrum. Even former rivals of Mr. Netanyahu, like Mr. Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, and Benny Gantz, even these former rivals have publicly supported the strikes against Iran. So Mr. Gantz has said that when it comes to Iran, on the Iranian issue, there is no right, there is no left, there is only right or wrong, and we are right. So it's unified the political spectrum. And about 83% of Jewish Israelis support Mr. Netanyahu's decision to attack Iran. So this is a significant shift, dramatic shift from his unpopularity during the Gaza war, where most people, or at least many people, viewed his actions as being politically motivated. But the attack on Iran by Israel has been perceived as something that has addressed a genuine existential threat for Israel, rather than serving some kind of narrow political purpose for Mr. Netanyahu. And that's why there is this tremendous support that Mr. Netanyahu is currently enjoying. So the corruption trial has been naturally overshadowed by this. This conflict against Iran has pushed the corruption trial out of the headlines. His testimony was supposed to dominate news coverage, obviously, but it has been delayed. It has been relegated to secondary importance. And there were weekly protests that had been plaguing his government. These have been suspended because of security directives in Israel, which have prohibited large gatherings. And yeah, this could potentially be Mr. Netanyahu's Churchill moment. And this attack on Iran may have transformed his political position overnight. So the narrative is that Iran is the root of all anti-Israeli sentiment. And this narrative has taken hold in Israeli politics. And this has provided Mr. Netanyahu with a unifying external threat to the nation. So the question now is, what kind of victory over Iran does Mr. Netanyahu need to make these allegations and charges of corruptions, etc., to make these things irrelevant? There's a certain scale of success that is required. So for Mr. Netanyahu to potentially neutralize these corruption charges through military success, he will have to achieve multiple unprecedented outcomes that will, if he achieves that, it will fundamentally transform his legacy and his political position. So what are these things? First of all, Israel will have to entirely, completely, fundamentally, permanently eliminate Iran's nuclear program. So Mr. Netanyahu has said that Israel is very close to achieving its goals of eliminating Iran's nuclear program and Iran's ballistic missile threats. So he claims that more than half of Iran's ballistic missile launchers have been destroyed, and that significant damage has been inflicted on Iran's nuclear program. However, if you do a reality check, it becomes clear that the complete elimination of Iran's nuclear capabilities would actually require sustained, comprehensive action that goes beyond the scope of the current operations. So it is actually hard to believe that Israel is very close to eliminating Iran's nuclear program. So this is something that he has not been able to achieve thus far, clearly. Then there is more. the, there's got so for this to continue, there needs to be regional transformation. Um, and Mr. Netanyahu has claimed that success against Iran will ultimately lead to an expansion of the Abraham Accords, which would potentially bring in more Arab nations into normalization agreements with Israel. This would be a dramatic regional realignment, which will definitely overshadow the domestic legal proceedings against Mr. Netanyahu. It would position Mr. Netanyahu as a transformative leader who reshaped Middle Eastern geopolitics. So he needs this regional transformation to happen. Then he needs sustained public support. He needs electoral victories. Um, in order to permanently escape the political impact of the corruption charges, Mr. Netanyahu will need to maintain the current high levels of public support through to the next elections and beyond that. So this would require continued military success without the conflict devolving into a costly war of attrition, which could very quickly erode public support. And then the most direct path to making the corruption charges irrelevant would involve fundamental changes to the Israeli legal system and so on. But that's not a geopolitical matter, so we don't need to look into that. So essentially, he needs regional transformation. He needs the denuclearization of Iran, the de-ballistic missileification of Iran, and sustained public support that can only come through continuing military success and victories. So the question is Mr. Netanyahu's future linked to the outcome of the war with Iran, against Iran? And does Mr. Trump have something to do with this? I mean, Mr. Trump has been one US leader who has very quickly acquiesced to what Israel has needed to be done. I mean, you had Trump 1, in which nothing happened. There was no new war, right? Which was between 2016 and 2020. Then you had the Biden administration, during whose tenure you had the Ukraine war, which erupted, but there was no support for any military action in the Middle East region. But now, just a few months after Mr. Trump comes to power for the second time, he has gone out of his way to support this Israeli military operation against Iran by bombing 3 nuclear facilities. So is it possible that Mr. Netanyahu's political future is linked to the outcome of the Iran war? The Iran conflict has provided Mr. Netanyahu with a significant political breathing room. It has restored much of his political standing, but the long-term impact remains uncertain. In order to completely neutralize the effect of the corruption charges, Mr. Netanyahu will require sustained military success, significant military success, essentially a complete victory over Iran, right? And possibly regime change in Iran. So he will need the denuclearization of Iran, he will need a military defeat of Iran, and he will need a regime change in Iran. Beyond that, he will need fundamental regional transformation and also maybe constitutional changes or a legal resolution of the changes. So this current war, the war that has been launched on Iran, it essentially represents Mr. Netanyahu's best opportunity in many years to reshape his destiny and to cement his legacy. The question is whether this political revival of Mr. Netanyahu can survive beyond this immediate crisis. And it all depends on the actions of Mr. Trump. So it is most likely that even though Mr. Trump has bombed the 3 Iranian nuclear sites in just a couple of days ago, it's most likely that that has not achieved the complete denuclearization of Iran. It is very likely that Iran's nuclear program will continue. There's also a likelihood that they may be tempted to do a nuclear test. So Mr. Netanyahu will not be satisfied with what Mr. Trump has done thus far. He probably will need more, because his personal life is intricately connected to his political life, right? So now with this understanding of the background and Mr. Netanyahu's personal background and his personal need and desire for a significant and comprehensive victory, the question is what could happen now. Now let's look further forward and do some forecasting. Okay, once again, in just a few days, I have to make a new forecast because things have changed so much, right? So let's do another set of forecasts for the next 7 to 90 days. What is, in my opinion, the most likely scenario, which is scenario A? The most likely scenario, in my opinion, is scenario A, which is a negotiated pause in the war after a high intensity exchange. I think there is a 70% likelihood of this happening over the next 90 or so days. So there could be, first, a high intensity exchange, peak violence in the next 7 to 21 days. Then there could be a ceasefire framework that could be developed in the next 21 to 45 days. So the likely outcome is that Israel and Iran remain locked in tit for tat strikes, okay, which will possibly include proxy attacks. This may happen for another 2 or 3 weeks, and then there could be possibly a Qatar-backed offer of ceasefire, or maybe Oman-backed offer of ceasefire, right? And this could lead to a cessation of hostilities, and the bigger political issues are deferred for later. And if this happens, then the conflict will simmer down for a while, but it will leave behind a brittle Cold War, and sanctions will be tightened on Iran, and energy prices will be significantly higher, right? So the assumption is that both nations, Iran as well as Israel, will recognize that the escalation is not sustainable. The escalation costs are not sustainable, and both nations will seek a face-saving exit. And this would not be good for Mr. Netanyahu overall, but there could be significant pressure on him to eventually, at some point in time, to accept a cessation of hostilities. And that pressure could maybe not come so much from domestic sources, but from the US, right? So maybe, most likely, the US will prefer an off-ramp. Mr. Trump needs a victory, but not a military victory. He wants a diplomatic victory. Mr. Trump has been complaining very vocally, very vociferously about not having received a Nobel Peace Prize. So if he can achieve a cessation of hostilities diplomatically and that sort of thing, then that could bolster his chances for a Nobel Peace Prize potentially, right? So maybe Washington prefers an off-ramp that avoids a new regional war and possibly nuclear activities, right? And obviously, if you look at the Gulf region, the various monarchies in the Gulf region, they will prefer peace. They will prefer a stable neighborhood. So they may exert a strong economic leverage to protect the shipping lanes and prevent a wider outbreak of the war. So I think scenario A, a negotiated pause of the war after high intensity exchanges, that is the most likely scenario. 70% likelihood over the next 45 or so days. And we've had historical precedents for that, right? Now the question is, how do I come up with these numbers, right? How do I come up with the percentage, and how do I come up with the timeline? So you look at various historical precedents, and you look at other factors also. So what are the historical precedents? So you may remember there was the assassination of General Qasim Soleimani by the Americans in January 2020, just a few weeks or days before Mr. Trump lost power, right? So that was a big escalation, but Iran's response was a measured missile attack, nothing significant. So Iran has always, had this preference for tempering its responses, so which would indicate that Iran may be amenable to getting an off-ramp and going for a ceasefire. And then we have other historical precedents. There have been multiple truces between Israel and Hamas, mediated by Qatar between 2014 and 2021. And even the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, it ended in a UN Security Council brokered ceasefire. So there are multiple historical precedents that show that this should be the most likely scenario. Now, what is scenario B? And I'm doing 4 scenarios this time. Usually I do 3. So scenario B is a protracted regional conflict. This has a 20% likelihood of happening, in my opinion, over the next 3 months or so. A protracted multi-front regional conflict. So what happens is that there could be high tempo warfare that could extend for 30 to 90 days without a ceasefire. And so in this scenario, Israel will continue its systematic strikes against Iranian nuclear and missile sites. Iran will continue to respond, to retaliate through sustained missile attacks. It may also activate Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iraqi Shia militia coalitions and operations. There could be a disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, and that could cause a significant sharp tightening of global oil and LNG, gas markets. And the potential geopolitical impact of this is that the region could experience the most severe security energy shock since 1973. And that could cause the price of Brent crude oil to go beyond 120 a barrel. And maritime trade in this scenario will have to be diverted to the Cape of Good Hope, which is, severe. So that's scenario B, with a 20% likelihood of happening. And you've had historical precedents of this also. 1984 to 88, there was a tanker war that disrupted Gulf shipping. So it's happened. In 2019, there were limpet mine attacks on tankers amid the collapse of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And 2006, there was the drawn-out rocket exchanges during the Lebanon War, Israel-Lebanon War. So these are all historical precedents that point in this direction. Scenario B with a 20% likelihood of happening over the next month to 3 months. What is scenario C? Well, scenario C is a nightmare scenario. Uncontrolled escalation, and the escalation reaches a nuclear threshold and a US-Iran direct war. I believe there is a 5% likelihood of this happening over the next 2 weeks to 60 days, 2 weeks to 2 months. Okay, this is an uncontrolled cascade. So in this hopefully very unlikely scenario, some kind of a mutual miscalculation will drive Iran to sprint towards a demonstration nuclear device, a nuclear test. And Israel and the US will contemplate possibly massive conventional strikes or even potentially tactical nuclear strikes. And in this scenario, there could be open US-Iran naval and air clashes that could erupt in the Gulf region. And the potential geopolitical impact of this disaster is that this would be the first open great power regional conflict, great power against regional power war of the 21st century. And this will trigger a global recession, and this will fracture the non-proliferation regime. And then multipolarity will essentially mean that every nation that is a multipolar, one of the major poles will need nuclear weapons for safety. Right? So this is a disaster scenario. And thankfully, it has, in my opinion, it has a 5% chance of happening in the next couple of months. But it's a very, very scary scenario. And then what is scenario D? There is one more scenario. Scenario D, again, has a 5% likelihood of happening, in my opinion, over the next 3 months or so. And this is a rapid de-escalation via a grand bargain. So we have seen this big shock. The US got involved directly. The US intervened directly against Iran. And there could be potentially significant but incomplete damage to Iran's nuclear program. So maybe these things, maybe they convince Iran's leadership that a continued conflict is untenable. And simultaneously, there could be severe economic fallout, maybe globally, maybe regionally, and there will be concerted diplomatic pressure from a coalition of nations like the Gulf nations, maybe Russia, maybe China, maybe the Trump administration. Maybe these nations compel the Trump administration to pivot from a military action to deal making. Maybe there'll be the promise of a Nobel Peace Prize for Mr. Trump. Right? In that case, secret back channels could be activated, maybe mediation from Qatar, maybe from Oman, etc. And this could produce a framework for de-escalation, which could lead to a grand bargain for Iran, where Iran accepts severe and verifiable long-term nuclear restrictions in exchange for security guarantees and sanctions relief. So this has a 5% chance of happening over the next 30 to 90 days. And this would be a Nobel Prize winning move for Mr. Trump if he can achieve that. So Mr. Trump, I would say, has a significant vested interest in getting this to happen, and this is directly in opposition to what Mr. Netanyahu probably wants, which is a complete military victory and complete denuclearization of Iran. Right? So these are the four scenarios that I can think of. So if you look at the forecast, 70% chance of scenario A happening, a short, intense exchange, followed by a mediated pause that could transform the conflict into a proxy conflict, a low intensity conflict, but an ongoing conflict. That is scenario A, 70%. Scenario B is a 20% probability scenario, a grinding 30 to 90-day regional conflict that could, border on nuclear dimensions. That is not a good scenario that we would like to have, right? That is scenario B. This could have proxy warfare. This could have energy choke points being affected. This could have sustained missile warfare, and even possibly nuclear tests, or maybe even nuclear strikes or massive conventional strikes. Then there is a low probability scenario, spiraling escalation. So that is scenario C, right? And then there is scenario D, which is a rapid de-escalation via a grand bargain. So that's the deal. Now, what is the probability of a nuclear test occurring? So I believe there's about a 12% chance that Iran will conduct a nuclear test, an overt nuclear test in the next 6 months, 180 days, right? 2% likelihood in the next 30 days, 3% in the next 3 months, and 7% in the next 6 months. Now, what is the... Let's take a look at... Let's do a detailed analysis of this. So first of all, is Iran capable of doing a nuclear test? Technical feasibility factors. So there are factors that increase the likelihood of Iran doing this. So Iran has enough nuclear 60% enriched uranium for multiple weapons that can be further enriched to produce multiple nuclear weapons. Iran, the IAEA has confirmed that Iran is running about 3,000 advanced centrifuges that are used for enriching uranium hexafluoride to higher and higher purity, right? And it is also known that Iran has at least one, if not more, previously secret enrichment plans, which would have parallel. So this means that Iran has parallel hardened infrastructure for continuing to enrich uranium to higher purities. So eventually they'll be able to produce uranium metal, which is 90% or more pure uranium, which is weapons grade uranium. But then there are factors that decrease the likelihood of a nuclear test, which is that the US strikes have damaged Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan. So that would limit the likelihood of a test. And these strikes could have forced costly dispersion of materials and equipment, and this will require a lot of repair, and there could be months of delay to possibly test a nuclear weapon. That's the technical feasibility. Then there is obviously also strategic and diplomatic factors. What could increase the likelihood of tests is that obviously it is very well understood by everybody that if Iran has a nuclear weapon or a set of nuclear weapons, that would definitely re-establish deterrence, and even the US would think twice about maybe taking significant action, military action against Iran. And if Iran, let's say, does a nuclear test, then there could be a domestic effect, a unifying effect, rally around the flag, that sort of thing. And people who may have been indifferent towards the government may also come and support the government. And we know that Iran has withdrawn from IAEA cooperation, right? It has fully withdrawn from this cooperation, which eliminates all the real-time external constraints. And US strikes may have destroyed on-site cameras and so on and so forth. So these factors increase the likelihood of a test. What decreases the likelihood is that a nuclear test by Iran, it guarantees massive follow-on attacks. It guarantees massive sanctions. What also decreases the likelihood is that Russia has offered to remove Iran's enriched uranium, which provides an exit ramp to Iran that preserves Iran's prestige without, it saves face without requiring a nuclear weapon, and active Gulf nation mediation from Qatar, from Oman, from Saudi Arabia also potentially could offer political alternatives to escalation. Excuse me. Now, here's some more triggers. Triggers that could push the probability materially higher. If Iran is able to enrich uranium into metal, more than 90% enrichment somewhere, right? So that could be that is definitely a high probability of a test. It signifies a high probability of test. Iran has publicly withdrawn from the Iran has threatened that it will publicly withdraw from the NPT, and if it does that, and if it frames a bomb as a defensive necessity in high level speeches, that could indicate a probability of a test happening. Test site preparation, if it is observed, then yeah, that could indicate the probability of a test happening. If the ceasefire, if any ceasefire happens and then it collapses and there are more strikes on Iran and so on, or if IRGC hardliners sideline the moderates and after leadership losses and they gain more power. So that could lead to a higher probability of a nuclear test by Iran. And the factors that could keep the probability low or drive it lower is if there is a successful conclusion of a Russian brokered uranium transfer deal in which Iranian uranium is transferred to Russia. That will definitely significantly lower the probability of a nuclear test by Iran. If there's a sustained ceasefire that lessens the perception that the regime may collapse, well, that will lessen the probability. If there are additional precision strikes by Israel that prove that Israel can preempt any nuclear test, that would reduce the marginal value of a test and it could lower the probability. And if China and Russia warn that an overt test could endanger crucial economic ties and arms support to Iran, that could also lower the probability. Now let's once again look at some historical precedents, historical benchmarks, nuclear test benchmarks. So one is 2006 North Korea. North Korea did its first test only after North Korea enjoyed relative security, relative sanctuary from any Western attacks, right? Iran at this point in time, right now as of today, it faces active bombardment, and there is no protective nation, no protective patron with a defense treaty that Iran has. Iran is on its own. Iran has no allies. Iran has no protectors. Iran has no patrons, and Iran is currently being actively bombarded, which is very different from the situation that North Korea was in 2006. And then we have India's nuclear test, Pokhran-II, not Pokhran-I, which was 1974, but Pokhran-II, 1998. So India had been conducting secret test preparations, maybe for years, maybe for months, whatever the time period was, we don't know. That's classified information. But India had been doing the secret preparations, and there was no threat to India, minimal threat to India. There were no threats of war against India or any such thing. India was not being bombarded the way Iran is being bombarded, and so on and so forth. So India faced a very different risk profile from what Iran faces today. And then there is Iraq, 1991 to 2003. So apparently Saddam Hussein had a clandestine nuclear program, and he wanted to have nuclear weapons. But there were intensive inspections in Iran. There was intensive allied air pressure, mainly by the US and its various allies. And eventually there was a war. Right? There were two wars, 1991 and 2003. But firstly, 1991, which destroyed Saddam Hussein's effort to develop a nuclear weapon before it could reach the position where he could have tested a nuclear weapon. So you can see that external force can suppress weaponization. So right now, Iran is in a similar position as Iraq was in 1991, even 2003. And it's possible that these historical precedents could come into play and potentially prevent Iran from going nuclear. So this is some historical context for us to understand what could happen. So the bottom line for a nuclear test is that Iran does have the technical capability. Iran can build and detonate a device within the next 6 months. But doing so would require technical capability. It would require reconstituting damaged enrichment capacity or moving to hidden parallel lines, right? It would doing a test would require accepting near certain massive retaliation that could threaten the survival of the nation and the government. And doing a test would also require foregoing diplomatic escape hatches and off ramps, which possibly could now be on the table. Gulf mediation, Russian uranium custody plan, and so on. So, given all these factors, all these potential trade offs, I would say it is more likely that the Iranian leadership will pursue an accelerated but more covert threshold capability, keeping its breakout ambiguous, and they would not want to stage a headline grabbing nuclear test at this point in time. So, even today, I would say nuclear test may most likely be low probability, you know, about 1 in 8 possibility. And there are multiple factors that could come in the way of Iran doing that. So that is the most likely estimate in my opinion. Now the other thing we have to look at, okay, we have now covered the potential, the possibility, the probability of Iran conducting a nuclear test. What is the probability, now we have to ask, of regime change in Iran? Right? Because Mr. Netanyahu has said that he has indicated that regime change could be one of the goals of this current operation, and even Mr. Trump has hinted that he's possibly open to a regime change operation. So then we have to ask ourselves, what's the probability of a regime change happening? And in my opinion, there is only a 6% chance that the current Iran government, the current power structure in Tehran, is overthrown and replaced by a pro-Western regime in the next 6 months. So maybe there's a 1% probability in the next month. You add a 2% probability in the next in days 31 to 90, and add 3% probability in days 91 to 180. So now the question you may ask of me is, why do I think there's only a 6% chance, 6% probability over the next 6 months? So let's analyze. Let's do some analysis. There are multiple factors that go into this. Leadership pressure. So there are factors that increase the likelihood of a regime change. For example, if there is a rapid succession of high-level losses, the deaths of high-level IRGC, Revolutionary Guards personnel, maybe the intelligence chief, maybe the deputy, which have happened, maybe other senior commanders. And this has happened, right? Some of this has happened. So this points to deep Israeli penetration and potential command friction. So if there is potential command friction, then there could be a higher likelihood of a leadership change. But if so, the Israelis have been conducting what we call decapitation strikes. But despite these decapitation strikes, if the if the supreme leader, Mr. Khamenei, and key clerics survive and they retain their ideological legitimacy, and if the nation unifies under the external threat, and the leadership unifies under the external threat, and there is no sign of elite fracture, then there is a decreased likelihood of a regime change operation. Now, let's look at the military and domestic factors. What increases the likelihood of regime change? So, if there are precision Israeli strikes inside Tehran, including the Quds Force headquarters, etc., this demonstrates the regime's vulnerability, and this could erode public perception of invulnerability, and this could increase the likelihood of regime change. If there are civilian casualties, and that would cause discontent, and then once again there is increased likelihood of a regime change. Domestic morale, right? But if the IRGC, it retains its coercive power, it has its proven capacity to suppress any potential unrest, if there are no reports of mass defections, if there are no unit splits in the current rank and file of the IRGC, if foreign attacks continue to rally the nationalistic sentiment, and if the war narrative deflects the blame to external enemies, then there is a decreased likelihood of a regime change operation succeeding. So, what are the triggers that could indicate a high probability of a regime change? You always look for triggers, right? So, these are all hypothetical triggers, these are all fictitious potential triggers. So, if there is the confirmed assassination or incapacitation of the supreme leader or his acting successor, that would indicate a higher probability. If there are visible splits inside the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, if there are rival commanders who are issuing contradictory orders, that indicates high probability. If there is large scale sustained nationwide protests reminiscent of 2019 to 2022, multiple waves potentially, this time if it's coupled with security force defections, well, that could indicate an upcoming regime change. If there is severe economic collapse triggered by a prolonged closure, let's say, of the Strait of Hormuz, or crippling sanctions, if there are shortages of basic goods, well, that could trigger a regime change. And if there is a coordinated international campaign by the US, the EU, maybe Gulf nations potentially, maybe to recognize an exiled opposition and so on, well, like Mr. Reza Pahlavi, whose face you can see here, well, that could indicate a higher probability of regime change. And what could lower the probability? If the continued Israeli focus on military, it's on military but not political targets, despite whatever they're saying. Words and actions are different. So the Israeli focus thus far has been on military targets, not political targets. So if that continues, then there is a lower probability of regime change. If the IRGC counterintelligence is effective in preventing any kind of potential organized dissent, if there are if the Chinese and the Russians, they veto any UN effort that overtly seeks regime change, this could provide Tehran with diplomatic cover. And the last thing that could lower the probability of a regime change is if there is the absence of a credible, unified, pro-Western or opposition movement from inside of Iran. Right? Because right now there is no credible, unified, pro-Western opposition movement inside Iran. And if that continues, well, that lowers the probability of a regime change operation. So let's take a look at some historical precedents. So Iraq, 2003. The Saddam Hussein government collapsed rapidly only after there was a full-scale US-led invasion of Iraq. Only after the Americans and allies put boots on the ground and launched a full-scale invasion, which took months to prepare for. Then that's how the Saddam Hussein government collapsed. As of today, as of right now, there is no comparable invasion force that has been assembled. And there is no indication there is any political appetite for launching a massive invasion of Iran. That would not be easy to carry out. Tremendously, prohibitively expensive, I suppose. And you need public opinion to support that in the US. Well, and Iran cannot do, and Israel cannot do that on its own. It will very much need US support. So that's why the probability is significantly low. Now, I hope you understand why. Then there are other precedents like the Arab Spring revolts 2011. So even with mass protests, nations that had cohesive security services like Syria, these nations endured, these governments endured. And Iran's security apparatus is very robust, right? And then Iran itself, 2009 demonstrations, 2019 to 2022 demonstrations. These were large-scale demonstrations, but they failed to fracture the government and its power, because there were no defections from the national elite. There was no foreign military pressure, right? So did not happen. So if you look at all these historical precedents and historical benchmarks, it becomes clear why even today, despite everything that's going on, there is still a significantly low, almost minimal probability of a regime change in Iran over the next 6 months, which is why I say it's got a 6% chance of happening, which is non-trivial, but not very significant over the next 180 days. Okay, so what's the bottom line? What's the regime change bottom line? So the Israeli decapitation strikes and economic strain have introduced non-trivial stress factors on the Iranian government. But and yet there is no evidence of decisive internal fragmentation, and there is no viable pro-Western alternative inside Iran, which could potentially in the future be poised to seize power. There are external actors like Israel, the US, the Gulf monarchies, etc. Potentially, possibly, some of these external actors, definitely the US and Israel, they aspire to regime change in Iran, but there is cohesion within the Iranian government. There is loyalty from the security forces. There are nationalist rallying effects in the population because of the war that's been imposed on Iran. Um, and there is backing from Russia as well as China, not boots on the ground backing, but diplomatic backing, economic backing, and so on. So all of these factors together collectively keep the probability, the prospect of an outright overthrow of the Iranian government in the next 6 months very low. Single digit range, 6% in my opinion. So that is the deal. Now, what do we need to monitor? We need to monitor multiple things. We need to monitor nuclear activity, enrichment levels, test site preparation, possibly IAEA cooperation or not, possibly from Iran. We need to keep monitoring the military cohesion in Iran, the unity or lack of it potentially in the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. How survivable the leadership is, how good the succession is in case it needs to be deployed, how cohesive and how robust the command structure is in the face of these external threats in Iran, whether there is any internal opposition at all, any organized resistance movement, if there are any elite defections to this hypothetical opposition. And we also need to look at diplomatic channels. Is there any mediation happening, and so on. So that is the deal about what's happening. That's where we stand. I think there is a low chance, significantly low chance, maybe 12% or so of a nuclear test by Iran next 6 months. I think there is a even lower chance, 6% chance of a regime change in Iran over the next 6 months. But we never know. So we're going to have to keep an eye on the developments. We're going to have to keep an eye on it day by day, week by week, because things change. Things change very rapidly sometimes. And, some factors may come in from out of the blue, like they say. So I'll keep an eye on this. And this brings me to the end of today's episode. I hope it was valuable for you. And if you have any questions, I'll take your questions in the Ask Abhijit live stream, which will begin shortly, as soon as this ends. So thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you very soon in the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.